We didn't evolve on, pastries and donuts and bread and all of these factory made foods. We evolved on meat and whatever we could hunt or, hunt and gather.
Hey everyone, welcome back to the Reshape Your Health podcast. We're going to have a really fun conversation today with Shana Hussin, and she's a registered dietitian, nutritionist, and intermittent fasting expert. Y'all know I love having registered dietitians on the show, and I love hearing about how what they learned in school might be different than what they're practicing today. She has a really wonderful story about just healing, her own body, helping her child heal, and we're going to learn all about that. And before we do, I just wanted to let you know kind of the main topics that we're going to talk about today, because we haven't touched on them so much in the show. We haven't really talked a lot about PCOS, polycystic ovarian syndrome. So we're going to touch on that. And then the other thing I wanted to touch on were various fasting schedules that you can use to break a weight loss plateau, for example, or if your blood sugars are kind of stable on your current fasting schedule, you want to lower them. We're going to talk about how to do that. And then the other thing that we're going to talk about is how do you find kind of your carb threshold, like where to start with carbohydrates when you're working on a low carb lifestyle? How do you know where to start so you don't kind of like fully press down on that gas pedal and burn yourself out? So welcome to the show. Thank you so much for being here, Shana. I love your Instagram account. So if people don't already follow you on Instagram, definitely do that because she puts out a lot of great content on insulin resistance. But just start with your story. Tell us who you are, what you're about, how you came into the field of, being a registered dietitian, and then finding this space of low carb intermittent fasting.
Yeah, thanks for the introduction and for having me on the show. It's very nice to be here. So yeah, I'm a registered dietitian. I've been in the field for over 20 years. So I am no longer at the rookie status, but I have done a lot of different work in that time. So I was traditionally trained in the dietetic system. And yeah, graduated in the year 2000. So it's been a while. I worked in the traditional setting in outpatient dietetics for many years, took a break for about 5 years to have our 3 children, and then went back into more of the whole health coaching area. And it was in about 15 years in that I just started to come to terms that my clients, patients, whoever I was working with really weren't seeing long-term results. And not only that is they were getting sicker, a lot of them. I'm like, and it was hard not to take it personally. Like I was teaching what I was told to teach by the Dietetics Academy and whatever it was that was laid out in front of me, that I had learned in school or had learned as updated information through the Nutrition Academy. But they were not only not healing, they were getting sicker in the process a lot of times, and having to up medication instead of reversing the disease and taking them off medication. Like I know now the best thing that can happen to me is as a practitioner is that people no longer need my services. Like I can send them away and say, hey, you're good. You are healed. You get it. You don't need me anymore. Like that is the ultimate compliment for me. But that was not what was happening. And about 15 years in, I was dealing with some of my own health issues. I was bloated all the time. I had chronic canker sores in my mouth that are like little ulcers that are completely terrible. If you've never had one, consider yourself lucky, but they are just these open sores in your mouth. And I would have like 3 to 5 of them at all times. Like it would hurt to eat and talk and smile. And my husband could always tell if like I had one on my lip. He'd be like, you have a canker sore. I'm like, yes, I don't even want to talk. It hurts so bad. But I was just like, why is this happening? Why am I bloated all the time? If I'm eating the recommendations that are put in place, like this doesn't seem normal. I was eating from the time I got up in the morning till the time I went to bed. And even though it was healthy food, I was a snacker. I was needing to eat. I was always thinking about food. I would take snacks in my cars when I ran errands. Like I just was one of those people who followed the guidelines, but didn't feel as well as I thought I should feel. And around the same time, my middle son, who's now 16, got very ill, just diarrhea out of the blue, and couldn't quite put our finger on it. And months passed, and he went through all kinds of testing and was ultimately had a colonoscopy the day before he turned 11, and was diagnosed with ulcerative colitis, which is a form of inflammatory bowel disease, which is horrendous. It's in the same class as Crohn's disease. So they're both inflammatory bowel diseases. And so we were kind of thrown into the traditional system, medical system, just on like none of us, there's 5 of us in our family, none of us had any major health issues prior to this, other than, well child visits and that sort of thing would never really been for visits. So I started to kind of push back at some of the therapies that they were offering and the medications. I'm like, he's 11. Like, I don't want him on these infusions and these medications that are lifelong. Like, there's got to be something better. And it's a digestive disease. But at the same time, the gastroenterologists we were working with knew very little, if nothing, about nutrition. So it's like they knew their medication tiers, and they knew how medications would interact and those sort of things. But you'd ask them like a basic question about nutrition, and it was next to nothing. And they gave me a list of very inflammatory foods for my son to follow as low residue, low fiber, like canned vegetables, canned fruits, grains, white pastas, all of the things that are very inflammatory for the body is what they wanted him to eat on a daily basis. And I just thought, oh, this is whacked. Like, this is crazy. And then, so I did like a really deep dive into whole and, just like deep nutrition, whole nutrition, back before, big food kind of got its ugly claws into us, and thought this is the exact opposite of what I've been taught to teach people. And a couple of years afterward, like we tried all kinds of different therapies for him, and we ultimately got him healed, and he is doing very well and thriving now. But I mean, that's a whole nother podcast. And that was years of him being ill. He was very ill for about 3 years, but we actually had to go out of the conventional system. And we worked with a team in Australia to actually get him well, because the conventional doctors here would not try the therapies that we wanted. So anyway, we had to leave the system. The same time, I was like, I'm getting out of this system. I can't teach this anymore. I don't believe in it. I had taken grains out of my diet by then. I had gone gluten-free. We were eating basically meat and vegetables and a little bit of fruit, just whole food nutrition. And then I started hearing about meal timing. Like, I was going deep down any rabbit hole I could go down to try to heal him in the process. Like, I was looking at the V word, the vaccines. I was looking at medications. I was looking at water. I was looking at glyphosate. I was looking at mold. I was looking at any kind of toxin or chemical that could be adding or taking away from his illness. And looking at the food system and where our information is coming from. And it was disturbing. So I was like, I can't stay in this system and teach this anymore. So I left the conventional system. I actually became a substitute teacher for a couple of years because I didn't even want to be in the field. I thought I can't do this. And a couple of years later, I started learning more about timed eating and intermittent fasting. And most practitioners who start teaching carb restriction and intermittent fasting have read the obesity code. And that was kind of where I got the start with that. And like I had mentioned earlier, I was one of those people, I was a long distance runner. I would get up and I would eat at like 5 or 6 in the morning. Thought I needed that to fuel efficiently. And so and anytime I heard about the concept of fasting, I would just kind of like, no, like I don't think that, how can that be healthy? And I decided like a year into it, I'm like, okay, I'm just going to start pushing my breakfast time, the time that I break my fast in the morning, back a little bit. And it was hard for me to even go to like 9 because I'm an early morning person. And so even 14 to 15 hours of fasting was a challenge for me. I stopped eating after dinner and then I just started to slowly push it back until I got to like 18 hours. And I was like, wow, I'm barely ever bloated anymore. I actually have more energy. Sometimes I feel hungry, but a lot of times I'm not even hungry in the morning, or, or I'm not hungry after a late lunch or an early dinner. Like I don't need to eat in the evening anymore. So I started to incorporate some of those things into my own life. And then I did go back into the nutrition field in 2019. I believe it was a very end of 2019, and was working with like some people on the side and a small group of people. And I just like, let's just try this intermittent fasting thing on a group of 20 people. So I put like my own mini study together, and I had people come in that were in there anywhere from, I think the youngest was in their 20s up until into their 60s. So a lot of these people were older. It's not like I was working with people who had never tried a diet before or who had never tried to adopt a different lifestyle. And they saw amazing results. I'm like, there is something to this. And it makes such sense. So I started to kind of write some resources for them and or do some worksheets. I'm like, you know what? Why don't I just write a book and put my own personal experience in there? So I started writing my book, Fast to Heal, which was published in April of 2020, right during COVID. So that came out 2 years ago. And ever since then I just started to run with it. I built my own online programs so I can work with anybody. I do all virtual programming and courses and education now. And it's just been amazing. And then, yeah, the Instagram kind of started a little later. And I was really stupid with it at first.
Yeah.
I mean, I just didn't know the platform. I'm in my mid 40s, and that just wasn't a platform that I knew very well. And having 3 teenagers in the house, they helped me out and helped me get started. But yeah, it's like, I just want people to get the right content and see that nutrition doesn't have to be something really complicated. Like we can make it really easy. And I love how intermittent fasting just simplifies things for people, and timed eating. And then just going back to basic nutrition really simplifies things as well. So that's kind of my story and how I got to where I am now. And now my clients that I work with, my students, whatever we want to call them, they do so well. And
Mhm.
it's so amazing seeing them, like I won't see somebody for 6 months and I think, oh, they fell off the rails. And then we have a follow-up and they're like, yeah, like this happened and this happened. And I'm still going strong because it's a lifestyle I can commit to and it's not hard. And it's so mind blowing. I wish I would have known this information 20 years ago, but all we can do is move forward and know now that the concepts that we teach are actually getting to the cause, the base root issue of why people are getting sick in the first place.
Yeah. So where you said that you were just kind of dumbfounded when you were like doing all of your independent research. You said offline you had to basically reteach yourself nutrition, having gone through formal nutrition training. Where's the disconnect there between what registered dietitians may be learning in school even today? Because I looked into going to school and I looked at the, American Dietetics Association, I believe it is, right? And I
Yes.
looked at their website. I'm like, I don't agree with what they're saying. Why would I go to school to
Yeah.
become one? And so where's the disconnect between what the research is saying about how do we heal metabolic disease versus how are we being taught to practice, as a registered dietitian?
Yeah, it's hard to know exactly because in the Academy of Nutrition and Dietetics, the first thing or one of the biggest areas they focus on is everything needs to be evidence-based. And so what I would learn in school, it's like you go through biochemistry, you go through human physiology, you go through all of these things and you learn about how things are breaking down and being utilized in the body. So you have it, but then you get out into practice and the guidelines aren't really following what you learned in school. And maybe it's been over 20 years since I've had the curriculum, but we were taught very little about hormones. And the only time insulin was talked about was if somebody had type 2 diabetes or a type 1 diabetes. Prediabetes wasn't even really a big thing 20 years ago, so it's just, and then in our internship, we were taught to, write down people's medications and what interactions might they have nutritionally was what we were trained to look for, but it wasn't necessarily like, what is this medication actually doing to my system? It was more, how do I have to exclude grapefruit?
That's what I was thinking. Yeah.
Or something along those lines, where we weren't really taught to understand the actual disease process all that well. It was more like, okay, nutrition, the foods contain this to counteract this. And another thing I do remember in my first job, which was at a very, like the clinic had like 25 dietitians. So it was a big nutrition system and nutrition department, and they were very progressive. But I remember seeing somebody would be on my schedule for weight loss, or they'd be on for cardiac. They had a heart attack and they were coming in for cardiac nutrition therapy. It's like we had like drawers full of handouts. It's like you would see somebody coming in, and I didn't do diabetes at that point because we had a separate department for that, and I wasn't a certified diabetes educator. But we'd go in our little files and be like, oh, this is what we need for this person coming in with cardiac disease. And this is what we take for the person with cancer. And it wasn't personalized at all. It was just like, grab the handouts, go through the handouts with the people based on whatever the medical nutrition therapy was for that person. And so it's like, I think the dietitians want to help, like they want to heal. That's why they go into the field. But to answer your original question, it's hard to know where the disconnect is, because you get the foundations with your, college education, but at the same time, the guidelines are what they are. And if you don't teach what the guidelines are, you can get in trouble.
And that's the US dietary guidelines.
Whatever, some of them are based on that. Some of them are based on the academy. So it's just kind of depends on, there's different governing bodies that will hand down the guidelines.
So a crazy story. And I don't think that this is 20 years ago. I think this is today too, because not too long ago, I did a home care evaluation I work PRN for a home care company. And I went and I did an evaluation on someone who had a mild heart attack, an NSTEMI. And she had this whole handout from the hospital on cardiac nutrition. And one of the principles that they told her to do was to replace saturated fat with polyunsaturated oils, such as canola oil. And I'm thinking, you've got to be kidding me. It's 2022. And we're telling people to eat canola oil. Who's coming up with this crap? And I was just like, oh, this is so frustrating, because this poor woman and so many people are doing and like you said, you were doing what you were taught to do and you weren't seeing results. And it's like, when is that going to change? When are these big governing bodies going to finally, swallow their pride and start to come out with the evidence? Because as you said, like being evidence-based is really important. And it's like, oh, I can't wait for the day, because then maybe 88% of adults won't have some sort of metabolic disease.
Yeah, it's mind-boggling, really, because I remember teaching people like eat canola oil, and now it's like, oh, it just makes me cringe what I used to teach people. And it's like, it should be like against the law. Like it's crazy what is taught in the hospitals and then taken away. And it's just, I think the one of the biggest areas that just needs to flip, and it won't, is the whole saturated fat
I know.
thing. It's
Yeah.
like, and now there's not even guidelines for saturated fat anymore, but
Mhm.
yet the messaging is still the same.
Well, I
Like,
was
don't
looking
eat any,
into,
don't eat any.
yeah, don't eat any. And it's like if you look at the diabetes plate, by the American Diabetes Association, there's not even fat on there. It's
Right,
like half of your plate is non-starchy veggies. Maybe a little, like a third might be carbohydrate, and then protein, and then low fat dairy on the side. And I'm like, where's the fat? Where's
right,
the fat? And we're all afraid of fat because we're afraid it's going to raise cholesterol. And that's based on a false paradigm that it's total
right,
cholesterol and LDL that we have to be worried about. And
right,
it's like, it's not, saturated fat raises HDL. It
right.
raises HDL, and it's like we have to worry about the small, dense LDL, and it's not that complicated. Like, understanding your lipid profile is not that complicated. But we've
Yeah,
been messaged over and over again to be afraid of saturated fat because it raises your cholesterol, and that's directly linked to heart disease. And it's like, oh, give me a break.
yeah.
This has got
It's
to stop.
so criminal. And I take snapshots all the time because I'll get emails from the Academy of Nutrition and Dietetics or
Interesting.
from different dietetic area sources, whether it's
Mhm.
a magazine or whatever it is. And I'll just snapshot them. So I'll be like, oh, protein helps with appetite suppression. Here are some good sources of protein. And it'll say like fish, nuts, maybe dairy, maybe not, peas. It will never
Only
ever list
plant-based.
red meat
Yes.
or meat ever. And it's like that's our best source of protein, but yet you still won't come to terms that this information is false. So that, yeah, that's why I had to leave the system. I'm like, I just can't. They
Yeah.
don't even really put eggs in there. And so, yeah, it's crazy.
Oh my
I
goodness.
snapshot
Yeah.
them all the time.
And
This is
people come to
not
me and they're
right.
like, well, I've been doing a, whole food plant-based diet and I'm not losing weight. And I'm like, that's because plants are largely carbohydrates, and you're not allowing your body to tap into your own fat stores if you're
Mhm.
constantly feeding your body the healthy, quote unquote, healthy bananas and apples and grapes. And I mean, I'm not anti-carbs, but I think
Right.
we have to transition. And I'm not going to say this because some people have, ethical reasons that they don't want to eat animal
Right.
products, and that's a different story. But
Right.
from an evidence-based standpoint, I think if we could shift to have a whole foods animal-based diet, versus a whole foods plant-based diet, we'd see a lot more nutrient density in the diets, and we'd see more protein, and we'd see more healthy fats. And it's like
Yeah.
there's just such a messaging issue when big governing bodies
Yes.
that have the word American in front of them, the
Yes.
American Diabetes Association, the American Heart Association, all these people have that trusted American word in front of them. And I don't believe that they're doing their due diligence to provide evidence-based recommendations, but that wasn't really the focus of this podcast episode. So, but
No, and it's weird because the macronutrient profile hasn't really changed much at all in the last 20 to 30 years. We went from the food pyramid to
yeah,
my plate, but it's like nothing's like the look of it is the same, but it's still promoting,
I didn't really think of that.
60% carbohydrate, very little fat, and a little bit of protein. And yeah,
Mhm.
people just have skyrocketing blood sugar issues as a result.
Yeah. Well, okay, let's talk about PCOS because I think that that was an important conversation for people to maybe understand. Um, you can't always believe what you're told, by big governing bodies. You have to do your own due diligent research. But, let's talk about PCOS and how it relates to insulin resistance because we haven't touched on that yet in the show on it, and I wanted to today.
Yeah, and PCOS, I thankfully haven't had to, that's not something that I've suffered with myself, but I do have several clients, and 80% or more of PCOS stems from insulin resistance. So, women, girls go and are having issues with their monthly cycle and are diagnosed with PCOS. And a lot of the symptoms are not anything that they want to deal with. They're having facial hair, they're tired, they're having bloating, they're gaining weight. They're not having regular cycles, or they're having cycles too often, one or the other. They might be painful. They might have heavy bleeding. They might not have hardly any bleeding. It's just, and it's the number one issue for infertility, which is good and bad. I mean, it's good because you can reverse it, but most women are told this is something you're going to have for the rest of your life. It's progressive. And unfortunately, there's really not a medication for it either, which is good for us, but except for metformin. Like metformin is a lot of times prescribed because it helps with blood sugar issues and insulin resistance. But yeah, I mean, at the root cause, PCOS is a testosterone issue, and it's a testosterone issue because of insulin resistance. So it all goes back to fixing that insulin resistance, but very few practitioners even know, let alone set you up with somebody who can help you reverse that. So in my world, I am connected to several dietitians and health professionals and nutrition practitioners that teach this, but it's just because I'm in, my bubble that I am with teaching low carb, teaching ketogenic diets in some circumstances. But the vast majority of women are going to be told that it's something they're going to have to deal with for the rest of their life. And instead of fixing the base root issue, which is insulin resistance and lowering insulin, they're sent to a fertility clinic instead, or they're put on the pill, or they're put on some kind of other synthetic hormone, which is just going to exacerbate the problems and make it a lifelong issue.
Yeah, I bet that that's going to become a little bit more prevalent too, because the rise in childhood metabolic dysfunction, and those women, those girls are going to move into puberty and be noticing some irregularity with their cycle. We're going to be noticing more childhood obesity, more kids that are overweight. And I think it'll become a little bit more of a prominent conversation, and we'll have to pay closer attention to it, but right now, I think, to me, at least, it still feels like somewhat of a newer thing, like somewhat of a rare thing. Maybe it's not talked about as often as we could. And you said in school that you didn't really talk about prediabetes, and it's like, we're talking about prediabetes now. And I feel like we're going to be talking about PCOS more. So thanks for kind of clearing that up and giving people some hope that if you have PCOS, it's likely related to insulin resistance. There's something that you can do about it. You don't have to take medications for the rest of your life. You can have healthy fertility. So great conversation there. But I wanted to talk about some fasting plateaus too, because a lot of times, people are fasting and they're not seeing results. And maybe they're doing like a 16-8 schedule, fasting for 16 hours a day, eating for 8 hours a day. They're not losing the weight that they want to lose. Where do you look next? So as a clinician, how would you coach them through that?
Yeah, and intermittent fasting is a highly individual, it's a highly individual thing, lifestyle, that people need to look at a few things that I coach them through when they work with me personally, or, just there's resources on my website that we'll talk about in a little bit too, that can help them with this. But everybody is very different, but I have yet to see anyone who adapts timed eating or intermittent fasting who hasn't seen some sort of progress with it. Maybe it's not the progress that they were hoping for, or the quick magic bullet that they're hoping for, but there's something that is going to be healed with intermittent fasting, timed eating, extended fasts, whatever they want to incorporate, except for a couple nuances with, you don't want to do it if you're pregnant, you don't want to do it if you're breastfeeding. And then I do get some kickback from people in the eating disorders world, and that's like, this therapy I'm not suggesting for them until they have an active eating disorder addressed, because you can just exacerbate the problem. But where do you start? So you mentioned a 16-8, and that's a great place for people to start. So that's 8 hours of having an eating window open versus 16 hours of fasting. Great place to start, but sometimes people adapt that and they might do great. They might like lose 30, 40 pounds in a year. And others are like, I don't see any progress with this. So you have to take a look at a few things, like what is your health, your personal health history? What kinds of metabolic diseases might run in your family? Like, maybe, do you have a lot of type 2 diabetes in your family? Do you have PCOS in your family? Do you have a lot of heart disease? Those things are going to make your fasting regimen different. Do you struggle with those things your own self? My plan for you is going to be different based on your family history, your personal history, your medications, and what your goals are. Are you somebody who needs to lose, 15 pounds and really are just focusing on longevity and maintaining? Or are you somebody who's got 100 extra pounds of body fat and needs some, advanced strategies for fasting? So it really, there's a huge variance in where to start and what where to go depending on your goals and your past history. But yeah, so 16-8 might work beautifully for a lot of people if they have very slight insulin resistance or they don't really have insulin resistance and it's just that healing for their body. And then there's people who will adapt to 16-8 and see very little progress because they have very advanced insulin resistance or very advanced metabolic disease. And a 16-8 is not going to cut it for reversing it for them. So that's where we say, okay, we might need to bump you up to the therapeutic level of fasting or play around with your fasting schedule because it will work. It's just, we have to find what's right for you. So a lot of times 16-8 or an 18-6 works beautifully for maintenance, but it might not be enough for you to reverse your disease. And so people get frustrated if they don't know a lot about it, or if they haven't worked with somebody who can guide them in the right direction, if they're seeing a roadblock and they just give up and say, oh, intermittent fasting doesn't work for me. Where really it was just their insulin resistance was too strong and we got to use some strategies. Or I have a lot of people who do a 16-8 and they're just basically eating through that whole 8-hour window and saying, hey, like I just fasted 16 hours, but yet they'll snack throughout the window. Or we mentioned a little bit about carbohydrate restriction as a nutrition therapy. They're eating 300 grams of carbs every day. And yes, they're bringing their insulin levels down in that fasting time, but then they're spiking their insulin so high during that 8 hours, it's kind of counteracting what they've done. So there's a huge variety. And that's where working with somebody who knows, who can look at where you're at now, where you want to go and how to get there. That's really helpful because it can be overwhelming. It's like, oh yeah, I can implement some fasting. I just don't eat for 16 or 18 hours. But then when it's like, okay, well, this isn't working, why? That's where it's helpful to work with somebody more individually.
Yeah. And I would like to talk about the therapeutic level of fasting that you mentioned. So one of my clients is insulin dependent type 2 diabetes, went from using like 50 to 60 units of fast acting insulin a day. She's down to like maybe five. And I think that's wonderful, but she's kind of like, okay, what's the next step? So she did that using a 16-8 lower carb approach most of the time. No one's perfect. And so I suggested like a 5-2 schedule where you're doing same thing you're doing 5 days a week. And then 2 days a week, you're doing like a 500 calorie meal. And that's like the 5-2. So that's one strategy that someone could try. What are some other first of all, what's the therapeutic level for fasting that you mentioned? And then what are some of your other go-to strategies, maybe for people that do have more advanced insulin resistance, with the caveat that they have to be ready for it mentally. There could be some mental blocks. We're not saying go do this right away. This particular client's been working on this lifestyle for a year up to this point. So just slow, steady change. So what's that therapeutic fasting level?
Yeah, the therapeutic fasting level works for almost everybody who is kind of stuck or not seeing the progress that they wish. But just like you said, it's not something I'm going to throw people into immediately. Like when I work with people, if they're ready mentally and they're wanting to come off medications, and as you mentioned, you can come off medications pretty quickly, like insulin can be lowered very quickly, other diabetes medications, but you have to work with your doctor. Like that's not what I do. That's beyond my realm as a dietitian. So you definitely need to work with a practitioner with that, who can monitor you and make sure your blood sugar levels aren't going too low.
Yep.
So
And
the
she does
therapy,
see her, as a caveat, she sees her endocrinologist regularly. Endocrinologist is on board. She does a continuous glucose monitor. Like there are definitely some safeguards you have to be mindful of if you're on either a blood pressure or a blood sugar medication starting intermittent fasting, because you can see results fast and you can get over medicated and have some of those adverse effects of the medication. It overshoots. So definitely be in line and in communication with your doctor, but also aware of your own numbers and aware of those potential symptoms before you get started here. So go ahead with that therapeutic level.
yeah, because it can be like days to weeks that you're coming off some very high levels of insulin, which is very exciting. But yeah, the therapeutic level is considered 31 to 2 36 to 42-hour fasts a week is the therapeutic level, where almost everyone's going to see reversal of that insulin resistance. And it's definitely something to work up to. A lot of times people like 24 hours is a really tough, that's something that needs to be worked up to over a number of weeks to months. So when somebody wants to do the therapeutic level, I always like, okay, we have to work up to it for at least a month. I don't want you just throwing yourself into that next week. And so I usually work people up to that for a good month. And then it's 1 to 2 36 to 42-hour fasts weekly, and not in a row, obviously, because that would make it more of a 72-hour fast, but at least a day in between those. So it's basically getting yourself to the point of an overnight fast. So going one entire day without eating, and then an overnight, and then either choosing to eat breakfast, earlier in the morning or later in the afternoon, depending on the person. And then re-nourishing at least a day in between. And sometimes people will add up to 3 of those, which is basically alternate daily fasting. But that's considered the therapeutic level when you get to 2 overnight fasts a week. Well, that's almost always going to reverse things. Again, you need to be mindful of not overdoing it and binging the days that you're not fasting. But what it does is it gets people into kind of those real low levels of insulin, enough to reverse the insulin resistance. And just brings, you're almost always in 36 hours, you're almost always burning out all the levels of stored glycogen in your system, so that you are into fat burning and your body's able to say, oh, cool, like I have other fat to burn. Because another thing that can happen if you're only doing an 18-6 every day is if you're eating a higher carb diet, you're never getting through all of your glycogen stores unless you're exercising a ton. So you're never really getting to the fat burning, whereas this will almost always push the body to fat burn. But yeah, you have to be ready for it. So that's one method. That's like the first thing that I throw at people if they're ready for it, is the therapeutic level of fasting. I like the 5-2 method as well, and either doing a 500 calorie approach 2 days a week. Or another thing you can do is the protein sparing modified fast a couple of days a week, where you're eating mainly just pure protein, about 70 to 80 grams, somewhere in there for women. So you're still able to eat, but you're only eating a finite amount of protein. That works really well with some people too. So those are the 2 things. And then the 5-2, it's just mainly just switching things up. Sometimes even just adding a 1 24-hour fast a week is enough to get people over the hump. And then of course we work with diet, and then we can manipulate that carbohydrate amount from day to day as well. But the key is to not do the same thing every day. And that's why the therapeutic fasting, that level works so beautifully, because your body's like, oh, hey, wait a minute, I have no food. Oh, wait, I have plenty of food. Oh, wait, I have no food. Oh, wait, I have lots of food. It's just it's always guessing and having to adapt constantly.
And it really forces it to be metabolically flexible. Um, so let's talk about kind of where someone starts with carbohydrates. Let's say let's say they do have type 2 diabetes, and they want to get off their medication, because this is going to be different for everyone based on your sex, your activity level, your age. There are so many factors that require you to individualize your fasting schedule. But where do you start with carbs for people?
Yeah, carbs seems to be the most confusing thing for people where they need more guidance. So I developed a carb quiz that took me days to develop, that you can find on my website. It's fasttoheal.info/carb quiz. And that's where I always direct people if they're wanting more information about where to start with carbohydrates. Because again, you want to look at your family history, you want to look at what your goals are. And so it's just a 7-question quiz where, I say, okay, do you have any of these issues, metabolic issues? Like, do you have type 2 diabetes? Do you have PCOS? We go through that. And then I say, what are your goals? Have you struggled with weight loss for a really long time? Are you doing this more for longevity? And then we look at your activity level, like where's your activity level at? And then we look at age. So all those things are factored into that carb quiz. And then based on how you answered, I give you recommendations. And so I like everybody below 100. I'm not a like zero carbohydrate person, but like we're saying, everybody handles carbohydrates a little bit differently. And if you're somebody who's thin and fit and works out, you can handle more carbohydrate than the next person because you just have more storage capacity for carbohydrates in your muscle tissue. And then men have more storage capacity than women. So there's a lot of little nuances there, but I like everyone below 100, because that's considered low carb, and that's low carb therapeutic nutrition, or low carb or therapeutic carb restriction is under 100. And then I kind of have it tiered from there. Like, a lot of people are eating like 300 to 400 grams of carbohydrate, like way too much.
It's crazy to think. I just feel like I'd be a bump on a log, like lethargic on the couch if
Right.
I had that many carbohydrates in a day.
Yeah, but that's what we're told to eat. 300 grams would be what? 1,200 calories, which would be about
Jeez.
half your intake. And that's what we're told to eat. So people are eating that. And we don't, all carb does for us is provide us energy. Like, it doesn't build things for us. It doesn't make hormones. It's just giving us energy, and we can run off fat as well, which is a whole nother topic. But yeah, I start under the 100. So if you're eating 300 gram of carbohydrate, like going down to 100 might seem a challenge. So again, I have people kind of do this in tiers. And then, if they're not seeing progress that they would like to see, and they have really advanced metabolic issues, and they have really stubborn weight loss, and it's like, okay, let's go to 50. And that will put most people in a ketogenic state where they're burning ketones, and it's very anti-inflammatory. And then I have people who still aren't seeing progress, and then we go to 25 and under, and just play around with it. And the thing I want to mention about carbohydrate intake is people are like, oh my gosh, I have to go down to 50 grams or 25 grams. It's like, when you get more metabolically flexible and healthier, and you're able to be more active, you can bump that up a lot of times over time. You can go to 100. So you don't have to always be at 25 for the rest of your life. But when you're trying to reverse metabolic disease and diabetes, it's necessary in a lot of circumstances. And then I do sprinkle the carnivore animal-based diet in there for certain subgroups for a finite period of time, maybe 30 days, to see how they're doing. If they have really advanced autoimmune issues or really advanced cases of type 2 diabetes, where, like they're going to have a toe amputated, or, like, then it's like, let's do the animal based, very, close to 0 grams of carbohydrate for at least a month, just to see if we can reverse those issues. and then go from there. So that's a lot of information
No,
about
that was great.
carbohydrates.
And it's
But that's why
great.
I developed that quiz, because it gives people, if they're not working with me individually, at least gives them a starting point. And then you do get a few emails that just explain carbohydrates a little bit better. But as you and I know, it's the type of carbohydrate too that you that you really need to focus on, the non-processed above ground carbohydrates that aren't so starchy.
I think we should touch on inflammation a little bit. One of our members had fibromyalgia, and her testimonials on the website. You can just
Okay.
Google it, but it was amazing. So she said she really switched. She kind of started her whole lifestyle 6 months before she even joined. So when she started out, she did 3 days of like a ketogenic carnivore type diet, and said she had no pain. So she went from debilitating fibromyalgia pain to none in 3 days, and she thought she was dead. And she's like, oh, it'll come back. That my pain always comes back, and it didn't. And it's like, so for her, having that really low carbohydrate level and tapping into the ketones, as you mentioned, which can be anti-inflammatory, helped her tremendously. And so that's why I kind of twinge a little bit when people are like, oh, well, red meat's inflammatory. Can you touch on that a little bit and I think that everyone is specific. So different foods, especially like gluten, dairy, those may affect people differently based on their microbiome. But in general, can you talk about the anti-inflammatory benefits of a ketogenic approach, or even like kind of cycling in and out of it?
Yeah. And so many people just don't ever burn ketones. Like if they're people who get up and eat in the morning, maybe they do a little bit while they're sleeping. But there's a lot of people who are never tapping into burning fat as a fueling system and getting the wonderful benefits from that. And I'm not someone who thinks we should be in ketosis all the
Yep,
time.
me
I think
either.
there's
Yep.
a place to be metabolically flexible and eat some carbohydrate here and there. And I teach people how to cycle that into their menstrual cycle if they're still menstruating. But there's so many who just don't even know what it feels like to be able to burn ketones. So yeah, it can be very anti-inflammatory in general. So there's being in ketosis is just that in and of itself can be super helpful. But then taking away plant foods for a time, there's very few people, and there's some out there who react to meats. And there's definitely some that react to eggs and some that react to dairy. But for the most part, it's the plant foods that have the anti-nutrients built into them, into their structure, whether it's seeds or lignans or oxalates, or, that's a whole nother topic.
Yeah,
But
that'd be interesting.
but plants don't want to be eaten. Like they want to reproduce and grow. So, and again, when I first heard these concepts, I'm like, what? That's crazy. Like we should be eating mostly plants. But there's definitely, there's people who can thrive on a plant-based diet, and there's people who really thrive on an animal-based diet. I think we can incorporate a lot of whole foods if our systems are healthy. But yeah, if people are having severe issues, like I encourage them to follow a meat-based diet, because we as animals, we just break down and assimilate and absorb meat and animal protein so much better than we would plant protein. And I think a lot of times people are like, oh, I need more iron, I'm iron deficient, I'm just going to eat all of this kale and spinach. And that's all well and good. There's some in there, but you're not going to absorb, like maybe it's 90% of what you need for the day according to the recommended dietary intake, but you're only absorbing 6% of that 90% that you think that you're getting, and you're not assimilating it. And maybe it's actually causing inflammation in your body. So it's really, really tough to know what foods you're reacting to when you're very ill. And you might think, people, sometimes I work with people and they're down to like eating 10 foods,
Yeah.
and because they just don't know what to do and they react to everything. And that's where I'm like, let's just take all plant foods out if you're willing to do it. And a lot of times it's just people aren't willing to try it,
Right.
because the carnivore or the animal-based diet is just going to serve as the ultimate elimination diet for you. eliminate all the plant foods, see if you're going to heal and feel better. And like you said, it's amazing how people's joint pain go away and their
Yeah.
skin issues go away. And then let's just
Anxiety,
bring
like
in,
if we
yes,
touch on anxiety
depression.
for a second, because I know when I'm eating sugar, I am more up. I'm more anxious. It's harder for me to be calm throughout the day versus as I'm really sticking to my low carb lifestyle. I'm like kind of steady Eddie throughout the day, steady energy levels. I'm much more calm with my kids, like, and her
Mhm.
anxiety went away. Her, like you said, her skin issues went away. Her dandruff went away. It was unreal. Like, and she got rid of a bag full of medications. It's just, and I think people are afraid of it. And so that's why I
Yeah.
wanted to, like, as a registered dietitian, for you to spread the message that it's okay. There's nothing wrong with trying it. Do an experiment on yourself to see how you feel with it.
Yeah. And it is just goes back to the messaging of red meat and saturated fat and that it's bad for us. It's like, well, that's what humans evolved on. We didn't evolve on pastries and donuts and bread and all of these factory made foods. We evolved on meat and whatever we could hunt or, hunt and gather. And if people go back to that primal nutrition, they can really see healing. But yeah, it's hard, don't get me wrong. I mean, you're tempted at
Oh,
every
yeah.
turn. And I've done carnivore animal based diet for just a few days at a time. Like if my bloating's starting to kick back up, or if I feel like I need a reset, I'll either do a longer fast or just animal meat for a couple of days. And it almost always makes me feel better, like
Mhm.
immediately. But it's hard to wrap your head around it and to think I can eat just meat as a nutrition therapy. But yes, and I know of many, many people who have cleared their mental health issues by following that as well, just like you were saying, and getting the sugar out and allowing their body to be in ketosis, because you're always going to be in ketosis when you're pretty much
Yeah.
when you're on an animal based diet, or a high percentage of the time for sure.
Yeah, what do you say to people who are thinking about following this, maybe ketogenic, carnivore, animal based? They're like, but what about my vitamins and my minerals that I'm getting from the fruits and the vegetables?
Right. And again, like I was saying, you just don't assimilate those vitamins and minerals like you would in animal products. So again, I'm not one who is like, let's stay on a carnivore animal based diet forever and ever. But I do try to educate people on, like, maybe you've been told you should eat a banana every single day or an apple every single day, where you just, like, we're all creatures of habit. We get into our little ruts, like, oh, I'm going to eat this for lunch, and then you just kind of eat the same foods. And eating seasonally can do wonders for people, because you're getting different foods in that way, trying to focus on local foods. People are like, well, maybe I should eat more papaya or guava or whatever, that something that's not anywhere grown near them. And then they wonder why they don't do well with it. It's like, well, as a human Caucasian from Europe or wherever you're from, maybe that's just not a food that is going to work for you. And I don't want to go off topic, but that's where I educate people. Like, let's try to do locally grown, in season produce when you are eating produce. So that way, where it's coming from, and that you're getting a good rotation. You don't have to feel like you have to eat that one single fruit every single day just because that's what your mom told you, when you were growing up. So I hope that
Um,
answered your question, but
well, I think to dive just a smidge deeper, are there any specific vitamins or minerals that we don't get from animal products that we need to get from plant products?
yeah, and I'm not an expert at that, but I've listened to a lot of other people who are more animal based, and I have heard, vitamin C is always one of those.
That's the one I was
um
thinking of.
yeah, one of the vitamins that comes up because it's mainly in citrus fruits. But from what I can gather, when an animal is um being chased or hunted or stressed, they will release vitamin C, and it will absorb into the muscle meat as it's being
Interesting.
hunted. So again, I'm not a complete expert on that, but if you're actually like hunting an animal, you will get the vitamin C through the organ meats and the muscle meat if it's been hunted. But we don't get that
Yeah.
with today's animals because they're not stressed when they're, being slaughtered. So that's why I just like, let's just do this for a short amount of time.
So you're
And
not
then,
getting chronic deficiencies. Yeah.
right. And then depending if people are incorporating organs into, that will kind of, that will bring a difference in the levels of vitamins and minerals, but there
Yeah.
aren't a lot that you need to worry about
Okay.
if you're
I should
doing one
look into
animal.
that. That's something I've never really looked into. I've thought of it, but I haven't done the research. I'm not an organ meat kind of girl. Maybe
Me
someday
neither.
I'll get there, but I am certainly not right now.
I
Um,
use the seasoning that's got organ meats in it. And I think you can go overboard on organ meats as well. And there can be some toxicity issues if you eat way too much. But for the most part, it can be very, very helpful to add those.
I've heard good things about them, but and then my last question, just to wrap it up here, is you kind of were talking about that therapeutic fast a bit back with like the 36 to 42 hours a couple times a week. And I had Dr. Mindy Pels on here recently, and we were talking about fasting around the menstrual cycle. And so let's say someone is premenopausal. Would you suggest that maybe she not do that certain weeks of her cycle?
Yeah. Yeah. I'm
Okay.
glad you brought that up. So I always teach day one is when you start bleeding. That's when progesterone and estrogen are both going to start to fall. And from the start of your period, a couple days after until you ovulate, which is around, well, depending on the person, day 14 to day 18, somewhere in there. Though that's the best time to incorporate those longer therapeutic fasts. And then the week leading up to your period, I always say, nope, let's not do those therapeutic fasts in that week.
Mm-hmm.
Let's do shorter fasts. That's when we do like 16, 20 hours of fasting those weeks, just because progesterone levels are rising. It's harder to fast during
Yeah,
that
it is. Yeah.
time. The cravings are higher. And it kind of depends if you are planning to be pregnant versus not being pregnant too. But yeah, the first 2 weeks of the cycle are the best times to incorporate those longer fasts. And then if you're postmenopausal, you don't really need to worry so much about that because you don't have the hormone fluctuations going on. And of course, men don't have the
Yeah.
hormone
You can
fluctuations
have
that
this
we
so
do.
easy.
Um, right.
Kidding.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up because a lot of times people, it's like they're white knuckling it to
Yeah.
even get to noon when they're leading up to their period. It's like, no, let's not force it. And that's a time where I teach carb cycling to a little bit more
Yeah.
healthy carbohydrates during that week, not going up to like 200, 300, but maybe adding like 25, maybe 50 grams of healthful carbohydrate
Yeah.
during that time. Yeah.
Cool. Well, thanks for clarifying that. And can you tell people where they can learn more about you and visit your website?
Absolutely. My website is fasttoheal.info, which is also the name of my book. And I have a bunch of different online programs people can do. I have just like a 10-day jumpstart. I have some more thorough programs that people can try. Some of them have group coaching, some of them are just online courses. And then I have a podcast called Fast to Heal Stories. And we talk a lot about intermittent fasting, but I also bring some other health professionals on there as well. And then I have some solo episodes that I'm just basically teaching a topic on. And then I'm working right now on a membership program where people can learn from me monthly and have some touches with me through office hours as well, because I so much of, of weight loss, changing nutrition, reversing insulin resistance is really just constant follow up and having some accountability and somebody who cares who you can check into. So that's why I thought the membership program was something that that I really wanted to add in so that people could have some ongoing accountability and education. And then, like we mentioned, I'm active on Instagram as well. And I post a lot of what I'm eating there, which people really like. I'm trying to get people to eat like 40 to 50 grams of protein a day. What does that, or a meal.
Right.
Does that look like?
Yeah.
And there that I'm just Shana.Hussin.RDN. So it's my name on
Perfect.
Instagram.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for this interview, and I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day.
Thanks so much for having me.
Yeah. Bye.